The call came on a night when the winter winds howled like wounded wolves. Snow pressed itself against my window, a relentless storm that made even the strongest fires inside shiver with unease. I had just wrapped myself in a shawl, preparing to sip tea before bed, when my phone rang. It was not my daughter's number, but an unfamiliar one. A woman's voice, shaky and hesitant, whispered, "Auntie, please don't ask who I am, but if you care for your daughter, come now. She's outside her in-laws' house, alone." The call ended before I could even respond. My heart lurched. I didn't even pause to think. I pulled on my coat, grabbed the first scarf I could find, and rushed into the night. The snow cut against my skin as I hurried, but the panic in my chest was far colder than the wind that lashed against me. When I reached my daughter's marital home, a mansion, like house glowing with golden light, I saw it. There she was. My daughter, my little girl, sitting on the frozen steps, her body curled in on itself, trembling violently as the snow blanketed her shoulders and hair. Her feet were bare, red from the cold, her hands wrapped around her knees in a desperate attempt to hold herself together. Her lips quivered, her face pale, her eyes swollen from tears. For a moment, I could not breathe. I stumbled toward her, my voice breaking. "Amna, my child." Her head lifted slowly, eyes unfocused, like someone drifting between worlds. "Mama," she whispered, her voice so faint that it was almost lost in the wind. I dropped to my knees in the snow, wrapping her with my shawl, my arms trembling as I pulled her into me. Her body was icy, her breath shallow, and I felt the terror of a mother who fears her child slipping away. And then, from behind the frosted glass of the living room windows, I saw them, her husband's family, sitting by a roaring fireplace, laughing, drinking tea, their faces glowing with warmth and comfort. Plates of food were spread before them, their laughter so sharp it pierced the storm. They looked like a picture of celebration. While outside, the daughter of their house sat abandoned, suffering. It felt like a knife to my soul. I wanted to storm inside, to tear their smiles from their faces, to ask them how they could commit such cruelty. But all I could do at that moment was hold my daughter tighter. "Why are you here? Why didn't they let you inside?" I asked, my voice breaking. Her eyes filled with tears that rolled down her frozen cheeks. She tried to speak, but only a sob escaped. Finally, after a moment, she whispered, "They said I ruined their mood. That I don't belong, that I should stay out until I learn my place." Her words cut me deeper than any blade could. Learn my place. This was the family I had trusted my daughter with. The family I had prayed for when arranging her marriage, believing she would be loved, protected, and cherished. Instead, they treated her worse than a servant, worse than a stranger. I brushed the snow from her hair, my tears mixing with the storm. "You belong with me, my child. Always. You are mine before you are anyone else's." Inside, the laughter grew louder, the shadows of dancing flames flickering against the glass. And with every sound of their joy, I felt something shift inside me. A fire began to kindle. Not the gentle warmth of forgiveness, but the searing heat of rage. That night, as I carried my daughter away from that house of betrayal, I swore silently they may have thrown her into the cold, but one day I would set fire to everything they thought untouchable. We took refuge in my kitchen, the kettle singing on the stove like a brittle promise. The house smelled of cardamom and old wood, a small island of safety while the storm raged beyond the windows. I wrapped Amna in a blanket, sat her at the table, and watched her shiver as if the cold had settled not only in her bones, but in her spirit. She had always been quick to smile, so quick that the smallest kindness could light her face. Tonight, the smile had been ground out of her, a fragile thing she kept hidden like a secret. I poured her warm tea and held it between her hands until the heat returned some color to her fingers. When she finally spoke, her words came in little, jagged pieces. "It started small," she said. "At first it was jokes. 'You're too soft. You don't know how to behave.' Meant only to make me laugh," they said. But jokes became corrections. Corrections became rules. Her voice was brittle. If I cooked the wrong thing, I was a disappointment. If I laughed too loud, I disturbed them. If I asked about money, I was greedy. I gripped the edge of the table to stop my hands from trembling. The image of my daughter on the steps had been one thing. The slow, daily erosion of her dignity was another. I had imagined cruelty as something dramatic, yelling, slaps, a single breaking moment. This was quieter, a death by 1,000 cuts. "Tell me everything," I said, though part of me already knew. Mothers have a way of knowing the small betrayals their children try to hide. She drew a long breath. They told me marriage was about respect. I tried. I bent. I changed recipes the way his mother liked them. I smiled when they mocked my family. I learned to hold my tongue. I thought if I became smaller, they would let me stay. But the smaller I became, the more they pushed. There were things she had hidden even from me. Phone calls deleted, bank transfers disguised as gifts, nights when the young woman my daughter once trusted left the house with a suitcase and returned as if nothing had happened. She described the way her husband had learned to look at her as if she were invisible, the way his mother would pat her shoulder with the same hand that rearranged her face in passing. One night, Amna said, voice trembling, I found messages on his phone. To another woman. Not hidden words, open, bold. When I confronted him, he laughed and told me I was imagining things. His family sided with him. They said I was being dramatic. They said marriage requires sacrifice. She laughed, a small, hollow sound. Sacrifice, they said, as if my dignity was an offering. I remembered the first time she met him. How she had described his eyes like a promise. I remembered the pastel wedding photos where her smile looked sincere. How could so many promises curdle into contempt? You didn't tell me, I said gently. There was no accusation, only a mother's puzzled hurt. How could I? She asked. Every time I tried, they smoothed it over. When I said I was cold, they said the house was big and heating expensive. When I asked why our savings were low, his mother tutted and gave me a list of what I should buy next. I thought of you. I thought I was protecting you from worry. I thought I could fix it myself. She told me about nights when she had stood in the bathroom and watched her reflection, wondering if the woman looking back was even hers. She had learned to swallow comments to avoid storms at the table. She had been called names, softly, in the kind of tone that made humiliation sound like correction. You are too emotional, they would say. You don't understand hospitality. You should be grateful for what you have. But gratitude isn't a chain, I said. Gratitude is a bridge. She squeezed my hand as if anchoring herself. There were moments, she confessed, when I thought of leaving. I planned it. Clothes hidden, money stashed. But then he would apologize the way abusers do, a soft voice, promises of change, a gift to show he cared, and his family would bring flowers and tell me I was the heart of their home. Her face folded into ruins at the memory. They made me doubt my own truth. We sat in silence for a long time. Outside, the wind scarred the world clean. But inside the kitchen, the air was thick with things unsaid. I found myself cataloging the injuries. The bruises I could not see, and the ones that sat in the hollow of her jaw when she clenched it. I thought of my own mother, who had taught me that courage was often a quiet thing, but who had never needed to face a wrong so close and deliberate. I should have noticed sooner, I said, stupidly, the words tumbling out in my need to own the pain. I should have called more, gone to visit more. Amna shook her head. No, Mama. None of this is on you. I am the one who trusted. I married the man I loved. That love was used as a proof of my gullibility, not of my worth. She wiped a tear away, fast and precise, as if she did not want to make the moment any more dramatic than it already was. But you taught me to stand. You taught me to speak. She looked up then, and in that look I saw my daughter, the same stubborn, luminous soul who had once climbed trees and read books late into the night. The cold had dulled her edges, but it had not broken her. Not entirely. Do you want to leave? I asked. Her fingers tightened around mine. Yes, she whispered. But I'm scared. They will make my leaving a scandal. They will say I embarrassed the family, that I was ungrateful. They will take everything. And sometimes, she swallowed, sometimes I fear I will lose myself if I start over. I thought of the world that judged women first and their abusers last. I thought of the whispered sympathies that disguised blame. My anger, which had been smoldering, now gathered into a mapped plan, the rage of a mother who would not let a child be erased. This will not be just about leaving, I said, the words forming like armor. We will take back what they have taken. The truth, your dignity, your freedom. We will gather what we need, quietly and without spectacle. We will not allow them to make you the villain. She nodded, fragile but resolute. How? I made a list. The small, methodical tasks that anger can make graceful: find evidence of the messages, track the bank transfers, collect witnesses who had seen the cruelty, but had been too afraid to speak. We would record conversations where it was legal and keep copies of anything they tried to hide. I would speak to a lawyer I trusted. If needed, we would take this to the authorities. But most of all, I would make sure Amna remembered who she was. Someone with the right to warmth, to safety, and to respect. As we planned, something curious happened. The ice that had lodged itself between her ribs began to melt, not all at once, but in the small returns of color to her cheeks when she laughed. Just once. At a memory of the dog she had wanted as a child, a tiny ember of mischief flickered in her eyes. "You always did want to get your way," I teased, and she pushed me lightly. The gesture of a woman reclaiming childhood freedoms. When the storm finally subsided and night drew its quiet curtain, we sat together with a map of steps sketched on paper. Each note was a promise. Each promise was fuel. They had thrown her into the cold that night to display their power. They had expected her to freeze. Instead, they had warmed something inside us. A fierce, methodical heat that would not be satisfied until the wrong was made right. Later, when I tucked her into my old guest room and watched her sleep, I whispered the vow again, softer this time, as if speaking gently to a healing wound. "We will not be invisible. We will make them answer." And somewhere in the house, beneath the hush of our breathing, the first quiet plans of revenge took root. Careful, deliberate, and honest. Not the revenge of cruelty for cruelty, but the reclaiming of a life stolen in stages, piece by careful piece. The morning after we made our list, the world felt different, sharper, as if the air itself had changed sides and aligned with us. The house hummed with ordinary life, the kettle's sigh, the distant rumble of traffic, the clock ticking as if to mark each step we would take. But beneath that hum, there was a new, deliberate rhythm, the steady cadence of preparation. Small steps, I told Amna as we sat at the table with the papers spread between us. We do not rush. We move like winter melts, patient and determined. She nodded, and for the first time in days, I saw her fingers steady as she wrote. She had become my co-conspirator in the finest sense, not plotting malice, but arranging a quiet justice. Our first task was the obvious evidence. We needed proof that their smiles were stitches sewn over rot. We started with what could not be argued away: messages, bank statements, and recordings of conversations where cruelty was made manifest. Technology, which had once been their instrument to hide things, now became our ally. Amna unlocked her phone with hands that did not tremble. Together we scrolled through months of deleted messages and shadowed accounts. There were gaps, calls erased, photos that had vanished. But for every deletion there was a breadcrumb. Some messages had been backed up to cloud storage. Others had been forwarded, perhaps out of habit, to friends who were now startled when we asked for their help. We made copies. Digital duplicates saved to a secure drive and printed hard copies tucked away in folders labeled with the simple dignity of truth. Next, we turned to money. The family had used finances like a language of control, small allowances couched as generosity, transfers disguised as loans, fees for maintenance that had been deducted from Amna's accounts without her clear consent. We traced transactions, asking bank officers for statements under the pretense of financial planning. The officers, sympathetic once they understood, handed us records in brown envelopes like pieces of a map. But paper and pixels were only part of the story. We needed witnesses, people who had seen the hushed humiliations, neighbors who heard the late night arguments, the distant cousin who had been too terrified to intervene. I reached out quietly. Some refused. Fear is a thick fog that protects abusers. It clung to them like a second skin. But others, unexpected allies, came forward. A driver who had watched my daughter come back from a party. A different woman in the same dress as the hostess. A maid who had been dismissed for asking too many questions. A distant aunt who had overheard a phone call where the husband's voice had been cruel and calculating. Each account we gathered became a thread. I tied them carefully, making sure each witness understood the stakes. I promised anonymity where it was needed and safety where I could offer it. There was a hush to these conversations, the kind that lives in basements where secrets are kept. People spoke in fragments, as if afraid that full sentences might conjure retaliation. We recorded everything, and when possible, we obtained statements written and signed. We also sought the law. I contacted an old friend of mine, a lawyer of quiet ferocity, who kept a small practice behind a shop of perfumes. He listened to our story without surprise, sadly practiced in tales like ours, and then set to work. There is a kind of cruelty the statute recognizes, he said, flipping through files. Neglect can be actionable, financial coercion can be tracked, and harassment has its own threads. We will bind these pieces together. He explained the path: file a civil case for financial misuse, and a protection order for immediate safety if needed. Criminal charges could follow if the evidence supported them. He cautioned the obvious: the law moves slowly, and public opinion can be a fickle beast. We will bind the law to the truth, he promised, but truth is a patient thing. It must be uncovered and presented carefully. So we were careful. We did not rage in public. We did not seek victims on a stage. Instead, we set small, strategic snares that forced the family to reveal themselves. I enrolled in their community committees, under the pretense of reaching out as a concerned mother, and made friends with their friends. I attended gatherings and smiled, like the woman I had once been: inconspicuous, observant. There were nights when I sat quietly at the edge of parties, a cup of tea warming my palms, while I watched the faces of those who had warmed themselves by my daughter's humiliation. They did not suspect me. In their comfort, they revealed habits, told jokes that made cruelty sound like tradition. A cousin's offhand comment about keeping the household tidy morphed into a description of how certain wives were to be managed. A throwaway remark about teaching her gave away the pattern of training by humiliation. These moments, small and careless, became the mortar between the stones we were setting. Still, the most potent weapon was the quiet rebuilding of my daughter. While we collected proofs, I taught Amna to stand in her own skin again. We practiced answers, calm, measured responses she could use when family members tried to gaslight her. We rehearsed ways to reclaim her finances, opening an account in her name, changing passwords, and securing documents in a safe deposit box. I introduced her to neighbors, to women who had built lives after trauma. They became her living curriculum in recovery. Women who had been small once, and had learned to be large without breaking what made them tender. There were lighter moments in the dark work, small rebellions that felt like stitches. Amna began to wear color again, starting with a bright scarf I bought her on an impulse. She laughed at a joke I told about an old movie, and the sound was like thawing ice. She began to take long walks, arms tucked into her coat, head held higher with each step. Every simple act was a brick in the house of her new self. As the evidence mounted, so did the risk. The family, ever perceptive when their pride was threatened, began to circle. They called sometimes, their voices honeyed and curious. Why are you here so often? The mother-in-law asked in a tone that disguised a threat as concern. I answered with warmth and a practiced calm. Amna needed rest. It was nothing. She's safe now. My calm was a curtain. Behind it, the plan moved. Then came the night that tightened the noose without theatrics, a charity gala hosted by the family, where their social standing shone like polished silver. They had invited the town's elite, people whose approvals were currency. I received an invitation, elegantly printed. Going would have been absurd. Staying away would too. Instead, we used it as bait, a way of showing, without accusation, what hypocrisy looked like. On the day of the gala, Amna wore the bright scarf like a banner. We arrived late, slipping through a servant's entrance with the quiet confidence of those who had authority of their own. Inside, the house glittered with crystal and laughter. The family greeted us with smiles sharpened by intent. No one offers generosity without a motive when pride is at stake. Throughout the evening, we did not shout or accuse. We simply moved. Amna spoke politely to the guests, her voice steady, her eye contact steady. I circulated, listening, and then, subtlety can be more devastating than a show. One of the men we had quietly befriended leaned close and murmured something into a guest's ear. The guest, who knew both sides of the story through a cousin not present at the gala, raised an eyebrow. Conversation shifted and moved like a tide. Pieces of the truth slipped from lip to lip. A pattern of small cruelties unfolded in murmurs. The family's polished image, so carefully built, began to show cracks. By the end of the night, whispers followed us out into the winter air. The family sat at the head table, smiling for the cameras, but their smiles looked smaller now. Tight, practiced, defensive. Someone had begun to look at them differently, to see the way they had warmed themselves while others froze. Still, the plan demanded patience. The law required proof. The social world demanded corroboration. We returned home with the quiet satisfaction of those who have planted seeds and know the season will come. But revenge? if it could be called that, was not yet complete. I had no wish for ruin for its own sake. My aim was reclamation. I wanted the neighbors to see the truth and the institutions to respond. I wanted my daughter to stand without fear and the family to reckon with the consequences of their arrogance. There were nights, alone in my room, when the weight of what lay ahead pressed like a stone. The stakes were high: reputation, marriages, the fragile web of a community's judgments. Exposing the truth could unsettle more than just one household. I thought of collateral damage, of children who might be caught in the crossfire, of elders whose own mistakes were different in scale, of the messy human cost of justice. But every time doubt crept in, I pictured my daughter's bare feet on those frozen steps. I felt again the coldness in her jaw, the way her shoulders had curled to protect her heart. I thought of the small, brave face that had, against all odds, begun to laugh again. That image steeled me. Justice, I decided, needed a steady hand, a careful measure, and an eye for the smallest harms. So we continued. We gathered, recorded, and built. We nurtured Amna's courage, and we tempered our moves to avoid unnecessary harm to innocence. We used the law as scaffold and the community as mirror. We prepared for the inevitable pushback, the gaslighting, the denials, the attempts to paint her as hysterical. We rehearsed, documented, and armored ourselves with clarity. When at last we felt the scaffolding could hold the truth, when the digital footprints lined up with bank statements and witnesses' accounts matched private messages, we were ready for the next stage. It would not be a spectacle of vengeance, but a carefully staged unmasking, a moment that would not only tell the truth, but make the community reckon with the cost of looking away. As the chapter of planning closed, the air felt electric with possibility. The small, methodical heat that had been growing in us warmed the house and our resolve. Outside, winter remained, impartial and white. Inside, a different kind of thaw was taking place. A thaw that would reveal not just one family's cruelty, but the brittle architecture that allowed such cruelty to thrive. We slept that night, wary but certain. The next steps would be delicate, and the world would watch. The night of reckoning arrived not with thunder but with velvet, an evening too polished to suspect the storm brewing within it. The family had arranged a grand dinner at their estate, a gathering of community leaders, relatives, and business associates. It was their way of stamping authority, of showing the world their unbroken facade. They wore clothes stitched with wealth, their smiles radiant with practiced ease. But behind those golden curtains, truth waited like a shadow ready to spill into the light. Amna walked beside me into the hall, her head held higher than I had ever seen in years. She wore a deep emerald dress with the bright scarf folded neatly across her shoulders. The scarf that had become her banner of survival. She looked neither defeated nor bitter, but strong, her presence an unspoken challenge. Whispers fluttered the moment we entered, threads of curiosity weaving through the room. Her husband spotted her from across the hall, his face freezing for half a second before stretching into a smile, the kind that hid teeth sharpened by years of cruelty. He stood and approached, arms outstretched as if welcoming a beloved wife. But his words betrayed him. "So you finally decided to join us," he said through clenched teeth, his voice low so only we could hear. "I was beginning to think you preferred sulking at your mother's house." Amna did not flinch. Instead, she tilted her chin, her eyes steady. "No," she said calmly. "I prefer being somewhere I am not left outside in the snow." For a heartbeat, silence fell around our small circle. He laughed too loudly, too quickly, and pulled her toward the crowd. "She has such a sense of humor," he announced, his voice carrying. "You must forgive her." But the cracks were beginning to show. The evening unfolded with speeches, glasses raised, and plates brimming with delicacies. Yet beneath the latter was a subtle unease, a sense that something unexpected hovered at the edges. And then the moment came. The lawyer I had trusted, quiet, steadfast, arrived with a folder tucked beneath his arm. He greeted guests politely, then leaned toward me. "Are you ready?" he asked. I nodded. At the height of the evening, when the father-in-law stood to give a toast about family honor and legacy, I rose from my seat. My voice, though calm, carried across the hall with the clarity of someone who had carried too many silences. "I must interrupt," I said, "for there is another story of family honor that must be told tonight." A gasp rippled through the guests. The father-in-law froze, glass suspended in his hand. The son-in-law's face paled, and his mother's hand clutched her pearls with a sharp intake of breath. I gestured to the lawyer, who opened the folder and laid its contents across the banquet table like a map of their sins. Printed messages, bank statements, and photographs gleamed under the chandelier's light. "Here," I said, my voice steady, or the words he sent to another woman while his wife sat waiting for him. "Here are the bank transfers where her earnings were siphoned into accounts that do not belong to her. Here are statements from those who witnessed her humiliation, her abandonment in the cold, while you all laughed by the fire." The room went silent. Only the sound of paper being shuffled filled the air. Amna's husband lunged forward, his voice rising. "Lies! All of it fabrications!" His words were desperate, sharp, but his eyes betrayed fear. The lawyer cleared his throat, his tone measured. "These are certified documents, gathered lawfully. And there are more, waiting for the court if need be." Gasps gave way to whispers. Guests leaned in, murmuring. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others nodded knowingly. Perhaps they had suspected but lacked proof. The father-in-law slammed his fist on the table. "How dare you!" "This is slander," I said, my voice like steel wrapped in velvet. "This is truth. Truth your pride thought would never leave your walls. But truth always escapes, no matter how tightly it is caged." The unraveling began swiftly. One by one, the guests who had built their alliances with this family began to step back, unwilling to tie their reputations to a sinking ship. Business associates exchanged glances. Whispers of contracts reconsidered passing between them. Distant relatives who once flocked to their wealth now moved toward Amna, offering quiet words of support. The mother-in-law, once regal in her cruelty, sank into her chair, her face drained of color. The son-in-law's voice cracked as he tried to defend himself, but every denial was drowned out by evidence too heavy to dismiss. And Amna, my daughter, my wounded bird who had once curled in the snow, stood tall. Her voice, clear and unwavering, broke through the murmurs. "For years," she said, "I believed I was the problem. I believed if I changed myself enough, if I endured enough, I would be accepted. But tonight, I see the truth. It was never me who needed to change. It was this house, built on arrogance and cruelty. And tonight, that house begins to crumble." Her words landed like arrows, strong, precise, undeniable. By the end of the evening, the family's polished veneer had shattered. Their allies had distanced themselves, their honor had turned to ash, and their name, once gilded, was now whispered with pity and disdain. We left the hall not in triumph but in quiet dignity. Amna walked beside me, her steps steady, her scarf glowing in the lamplight like a victory banner. The night air was cold, but this time it did not bite. It felt clean, bracing, alive. As we reached the car, Amna turned to me. Her eyes were wet, but her smile was genuine. "Mama," she whispered, "you gave me back my voice." I took her hand, squeezing it. "No, my love. You found it yourself. I only reminded you where to look." And as we drove into the night, leaving behind the ruins of a house that had once imprisoned her spirit, I felt no bitterness. Only the calm satisfaction of justice served. They had celebrated by the fire while she froze in the snow. But in the end, it was their fire that consumed them, leaving my daughter free to step into the warmth of her own dawn.